Well, I know that the big news today are the elections in Virginia and New Jersey, and I'd love to talk about that. But really, to me, the most important thing today, because so many other people are talking about that, is that today is Fed Day, which means that the Fed has, Jerome Powell, chairman of the Fed, held another press conference talking about the Fed's new statement in which they have announced officially that the taper has begun. Taper talk has turned into taper reality. And this is big news. This is very important. And I think that a lot of Wall Street is giving Powell way too much credit, which is really saying something, considering that even the media, the financial press, the lapdogs of the Federal Reserve, people like Steve Leisman and the gang, they sounded quite skeptical today. They were, I think, asking halfway decent questions. They weren't completely off topic. They were at least somewhat relevant to the situation. So it seems like the financial press is questioning Powell a little bit here. And what are they questioning him for? They're questioning his dovishness. They seem to think, hey, Chairman Powell, aren't you a little too cavalier about inflation? Don't you think inflation might be a little bit of a problem, just a teensy-weensy bit? And Powell's answer, of course, is no. In fact, when asked directly, what the committee thinks about this, the committee that Powell is the chairman of, the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, he said that the committee's not even thinking about inflation. They're not even looking at, is inflation a problem right now? Is it too high above our 2% goal, which, completely arbitrary. There's no reason why they should have a 2% goal. The Fed never explains why that is. They say, oh, our goal is 2%. And even though inflation is clearly above that, and as Steve Leisman pointed out, it seems like this year we're going to average about 5% inflation. Next year, people are expecting around, and again, this is the mainstream experts, are expecting around 3.5% inflation. Leisman says, well, hey, isn't that clearly above 2%? Shouldn't you be trying to rein in inflation and get it back down to 2%? And Powell's response was that, well, no, we're not even going to think about inflation until we've reached full employment. And he refused to define full employment. He said, full employment, it's not like inflation where we have a clear target or whatever. Full employment can be whatever we want it to be, because we don't know what the level of full employment is. So when every business pretty much is hiring and can't find enough workers, Powell thinks that the Fed can somehow alleviate that by keeping interest rates lower. I would say I don't understand the logic of that, but I know for a fact, given the way that the Fed operates, there is no real logic behind this. There's no reason why the Fed thinks that maintaining 0% interest rates is going to somehow coax people back in the labor market. And at least I cleared up something from Powell's press conference. I thought what he was saying was he thought there were too many people out there still looking for work who couldn't find a job. And that's why we had to keep interest rates low, so that businesses, would be incentivized to borrow more money and expand their business and hire new workers. Because that's the normal justification for why a central bank wants to keep interest rates low. They say, well, it's to help out the unemployed people. But here, the problem clearly is that not enough people want to work. And, Powell, I have to give him some credit. He pointed out, hey, we thought that people would go back to work once the expanded unemployment benefits expired, which, hey, the narrative that people are staying home because they're just being paid so much by the federal government to stay home and not work, that's kind of dead now, because all those expanded unemployment benefits are gone, to my extent. I mean, I know for a fact, at least I don't think that I could live for free better than I am right now working. And so it's hard to know why people are staying home. But Powell, for some reason, I don't think he has a reason, but he claims that he has to keep interest rates at zero because somehow that's going to coax people back into the labor force. And even if that doesn't make any sense, he needs to keep interest rates at zero until people start working again. It's like he's on an interest rate strike. He's quite literally cutting off his nose to spite his face. He's saying, hey, we've got this problem in the labor market, so let's create a problem with inflation too. Let's create a bunch of inflation just, because we have this problem in the labor market, you see, and that's it. There's no deeper explanation other than that. And one of the most hilarious things that he said in all this was he was talking about this idea of inflation being transitory. Transitory in the same way that inflation was transitory, back in the 1970s when it went on for many years. Yes, inflation came to an end eventually. That's true. So you can say that was transitory. Well, Jerome Powell addressed this. He addressed the idea of transitory having a multiplicity of meanings. And he said, I believe he said this today, when I say transitory, I mean basically the prices are going to come back down. Like, they'll go up for a little while and then they'll come back down to where they were, which is absurd. I gave Powell more breathing room than that. I wasn't that strict with the definition of transitory when I was trying to figure out what he was saying before. When he was saying transitory before, I figured he was just saying, hey, inflation is going to go from 2% up to 5% for a little while, and then it'll go back down to 2%. Powell is saying what he meant was inflation is going to spike up for a little bit, and then we're going to have deflation to go back to the level where we were before inflation spiked, which is absurd. That's not going to happen. I wish it would happen. We should have deflation year after year. Do you know what deflation means? Deflation is a fancy word for the cost of living going down, something that used to happen in this country. It used to be that we would get better at producing things, technology would improve, people would invent new devices that multiplies the force of our labor, and so therefore the country as a whole became wealthier. There was more that could be produced, and things got cheaper, and so therefore the cost of living went down. Nowadays, you're running on a treadmill that keeps speeding up year after year, and so every year you have to run faster and faster just to stay in the same spot. Now, with regard to this phenomenon to where the media actually seem to be concerned about inflation, I'm of two minds on this. Most people, who are typically critical of the media, if the media says something that they agree with, they go, wow, I'm so right. It's so obvious that I'm right that even the media agrees with me. I am someone who thinks the opposite. When I think that something like inflation is a problem, and then I see the media agrees with me, I have to double check myself and really consider, am I right about this? Because I should not be in agreement with the media. And that might sound petty. That might sound stupid. But most of the time, you're going to be more, you're right. If you're someone who's typically critical of the media, and you find yourself in a situation where you're in agreement with them, more often than not, you're making a mistake somewhere. And honestly, I have to consider that because I can't find the direct correlation between what the Fed is doing and the inflation that we're experiencing now. Interest rates have been at 0% for most of my lifetime, I think. Yeah, most of my lifetime, interest rates have been at zero now that I think about it. And we haven't had this high of inflation until, the last few months. And so is it really fair to say that the Fed is causing this inflation? Well, what has the Fed done different over the past few months? Well, they ramped up QE. Well, that's something that you can examine, because what is QE? The Fed is subsidizing mortgage-backed securities and U.S. Treasuries. They are monetizing federal government debt. So to the extent that the Fed is financing and writing a blank check to the federal government, and the federal government is just taking that printed money and spending it into the economy, that would create inflation. And the same is true with mortgage-backed securities. The Fed is stimulating artificial demand for mortgages in financial markets, and that incentivizes mortgage originators to write more mortgages. But is that really the case? Is the easier lending standards really what's driving this big boom in the housing market and the boom in housing prices, the astronomical increases in housing prices? Can that be directly tied to the Fed's QE? It's hard to say because the interest rates were already so low to begin with. Is this extra push that they're getting to the downside from QE really enough to make a difference to create such a massive housing boom? I would like to think that I know the answers to all these questions. But if you study the economy long enough, what you learn is that it's the most complex organism on the planet. There's an infinite number of variables which affect the economy in different sectors of the economy, that it makes it impossible to isolate specific factors. But we do our best. Now, the Fed, the other thing we have to consider with the Fed, tapering both their purchases of mortgage-backed securities and treasury bonds. One, is the Fed's QE really putting that much of a that much downward pressure on treasury yields? I don't know, because we don't know what yields would have looked like in the absence of QE, which is currently at a pace of $80 billion a month. Because either way, whether the money that the federal government is spending, which they get by issuing bonds, whether they get that from the Fed or from other banks or from other people, that money is not coming from the real economy. It's not like you have ordinary consumers taking their savings and buying treasury bonds. Nobody does that because they don't pay anything. Financial institutions buy treasury bonds. And that money that is being put into the treasury market to buy up these bonds is not circulating in the consumer economy. And so either way, whether the Fed buys these bonds or whether the private sector, the quote-unquote private sector, is quasi-private, it's fascistic, our financial system, corporatist, fascistic is kind of, well, I don't want to get into debating semantics. But my point is, either way, that money is going to stimulate inflation if the federal government is spending this much money. And so it'll be interesting. I would like to see, can the federal government go along spending this much without Fed support? I think the answer is probably yes, without a significant spike in treasury yields. Because the idea is, if the federal government just issues tons and tons of bonds, the so-called private sector is not going to buy them all up. There's just not enough demand, and so yields will have to rise. And therefore, that's why the Fed has to come in with quantitative easing to essentially do yield curve control. I'm not convinced that that's the case, especially after the Virginia governor's election last night, and almost more shockingly, the New Jersey governor's election last night. Now, the Republican didn't win in New Jersey, but the fact that it was even close, that it was as close as it was within, I think it was in the 5-figure range, within tens of thousands, I think, at this point. But the Republican was clearly leading for quite some time. That was an amazing sight. And of course, in Virginia, the Republicans swept all the top offices. And to borrow some wisdom from old Robert Barnes, the real winner last night, the biggest winner, was West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin, who has been holding out on all of the Dems' biggest spending bills and the core of the Democrat agenda. He has been holding it up because he is a red state Democrat. And the Dems have been telling Manchin, if you just go along with what we want, everyone will love us. It'll be very popular. And what we saw last night in Virginia and New Jersey is that the Democrat agenda as currently constituted, and I'm going to connect this to the Fed here in a second, is not popular. People are running away from the Dems. And people like Joe Manchin, all of a sudden today, look pretty darn smart. And so, in the wake of yesterday's events, I think that the Dems are not going to be spending as insanely. They're not going to be spending as many trillions of dollars. They're not going to be issuing as many trillions in bonds as they otherwise would have if the election went a different way. If the Democrats felt emboldened, if they felt like, hey, we can just pass anything and that's what people want. We could pass this, $3.5 trillion bill. We could pass a $5 trillion bill. They probably would do it. They would keep dumping and dumping more and more money into the economy. They would throw money at the economy, and that would exacerbate the problem of inflation. Or it might drive up Treasury yields if you think that there's not enough demand for Treasury bonds. But if the Dems are not going to be spending that much money, if they don't have to issue that many bonds, well, it's a different story now, isn't it? So you see what I mean when I say there's all these cross currents and all these different factors that you cannot control for, that you cannot simply isolate. And so at this point, to me, the biggest wild card, the biggest mystery, is the issue of the labor market. How and when do all of these open positions get filled? It wasn't too long ago. People were talking about, oh my gosh, automation is such a big threat because where are all these people going to work then? Everyone's going to be unemployed. And now the issue is, gosh, we need a lot of robots because there's nobody to fill all these jobs. And it doesn't make any sense because how can people afford to consume all of these services and all these goods when there's nobody producing them? How are the people how do consumers consume these resources without producing anything themselves? Because the way an economy works is somebody produces some good or service. They sell that good or service. They obtain money. Then they take that money and they go and purchase goods and services from other people. And so your power to consume is rooted in how much you produce. And that's true in the aggregate as well. Even if you have, a welfare state and wealth redistribution, the ability of the entire nation to consume is constrained by the ability of the entire nation to produce. Or if you have the world's reserve currency like the United States does, and you're less constrained by Say's law, because you're able to print a lot of money without having a directly proportionate increase in inflation, because of the nature of world reserve currency status, which I won't get into here. Even if you find yourself in that position, the money has to make its way into consumers' hands somehow. If we were seeing, $1,000 checks, Andrew Yang style, getting mailed out to every person in America, I could understand what's going on a little bit more. But honestly, I just don't see how this many people are making enough money just sitting at home and not working to demand so much in terms of goods. But one thing I do know is that Jerome Powell, keeping interest rates pegged at 0%, is not going to coax these people to get off the couch. I know a business owner who has had to hire a lot more employees than they have had in the past because they can't get the employees that they have to work a full day or to work a full week. They can't get people who want to work 40 hours. Everybody if you can't find anybody who wants to work, they want to work part-time. And it's amazing. You look at all these people and you say, how are they able to survive working part-time? Housing is very expensive in my area. Rent is absurd. And of course, the price of everything else is going up very quickly as well. And so this is a huge piece of the puzzle that, as long as we can't find this piece, as long as we can't figure out how to fill this gap in our knowledge, I don't know how we're going to understand the big picture here. So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.